Welcome to Beyond the Battlefield, the exclusive podcast of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research, where we provide access to insights on the intersection of science and service. Each week, we meet with leading researchers and people with lived experience to discuss issues affecting military, veterans, and families. Join us as we unpack the findings to bridge the gap between military, veteran, and family health research and real-world impact. In today's episode, we sit down with Dr. Linna Tam-Seto and Dr. Deborah Norris to discuss the evolution of family research, the impact of service from the perspective of adult children, care experiences, and supports for military families. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. As you listen to this podcast, feel free to leave feedback in the comment section below. Did you learn something new? Do you have something to share about the topics we discussed? At the end of this podcast, we also invite you to complete a short survey by clicking on the survey link in the podcast description section. Dr. Linna Tam-Seto is an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of Toronto. She holds a PhD in rehabilitation science and is a registered occupational therapist with experience working in children, adolescent, and family mental health and supporting evidence-based professional practice. Dr. Tam-Seto was the inaugural postdoctoral research fellow with the Canadian Defence and Security Network, completing her work at the Centre for International and Defence Policy, developing a mentorship program aimed at supporting women in the Canadian Armed Forces. She led the Military Health and Wellbeing Research Group in the Trauma and Recovery Research Unit at McMaster University and is a research scientist with the Family Matters Research Group. Dr. Tam-Seto's research interests include understanding the health and well-being of Canadian military members, veterans, public safety personnel, and their families. Holding undergraduate and graduate degrees in family science, Dr. Norris is a professor in the Department of Family Studies and Gerontology at Mount St. Vincent University. Informed by ecological theory and critical theory, Dr. Norris's research program is applied, collaborative, and interdisciplinary. She has facilitated studies focusing on the mental health and well-being of veteran families with a particular emphasis on resilience. Dr. Norris's military and veteran family research program was recognized through her designation as a fellow with the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research in 2017. Hi, Dr. Norris and Dr. Tam-Seto. We are excited to have you today on the Beyond the Battlefield podcast to discuss your research and the impact on military families. I can honestly say that I am a big fan of both of your work. I've had lots of opportunities to chat before, so I'm looking forward to today's conversation. In the first episode of Beyond the Battlefield, we had Drs. Cram and Dr. Fear providing an overview on military families, including military family experiences and families being represented in the research. Since we are doing an entire series dedicated to military families, we've included guests that have diverse perspectives and research backgrounds. To start off today, I was hoping that you could touch on the current state of military family research and how your work focuses on families. To start off, Dr. Norris, if you could answer that first, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, the state of military family research in Canada is a topic that I always love to chat about. There were many years where the Canadian military family experience was kind of hiding in plain sight. It was underneath the radar. Sometimes we refer to this as sort of lost in the wilderness. But in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a growing recognition that families are not only central to the mental health and well-being of serving members and through transition beyond to being a veteran, but yet they are integral to the well-functioning of the military system, the military institution. And we've shifted from there in the last short while, and Dr. Tam-Seto would be privy to this evolution as well, to honoring the ways in which military family members support and sustain the military member, but also the institution, to thinking about how families warrant attention in research, policy, and practice in their own right. And that's become kind of a tagline to a lot of the work that we're both doing, is in their own right, that unequivocally families need support. And that support needs to be evidence-based, coming from the research that she and I do, as well as our colleagues in Canada. I should also note that in Canada, and Linna, you were part of this team way back in the day, in Canada, we were so far behind. Remember back in 2015 when we did that scoping review? And it was rather chilling to see how in the UK and in the United States, in Australia and Israel, the needle had moved so far ahead in terms of understanding military family experience. And in Canada, we had really nothing until we started to band together and make that difference. So that's where we are, and that's where we are with military family research in Canada today.
I can remember I've been fortunate enough to be part of this evolution, I guess is the best way to say it, the evolution of military family research in Canada, starting back, like Dr. Norris was saying, back in 2015, in those early days. What has been interesting to me is how the perspective has really shifted. It was really much around like, oh, there's a family there. Let's find out what it's like for them. There's the wife and the 2.1 children. Let's look at their experiences, to really opening the door wider to say we have family is defined how a collective of individuals define themselves. So, I mean, I think that has been a big shift in the work that we do, is redefining family in ways that really is reflective of the way Canadian society is represented now. So I think that has been a big shift. And also looking at, like Dr. Norris was saying, that families deserve to be understood within themselves, not as the person who supports the military member or the person who supports the veteran, but because of these occupational demands and requirements of the job, their lives are implicitly affected as well. And it's really important to know how the job affects families. So I think we're at a really exciting time now. I think Canada is really leaps and bounds ahead. We're in step with our colleagues internationally and leading some really interesting work as well in shifting that perspective, that it's not just about, oh, by the way, there's a family, how does service impact them, but really looking at, well, how does it really impact them as individuals? So I think that's really quite exciting, and I'm proud to be part of that group within the Canadian research context.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. It's exciting to see how there is this kind of evolution of Canadian military family research. There's a lot of supports being dedicated to these individuals. Dr. Norris, I was reading through one of your papers, and there's a line in there that talked about how the context of living as a military family. So we're seeing changes on what a family is and who a family is on a civilian side as well. But this context of living as a military family has largely potentially disappeared, or at least changed, since the 1990s. Can you touch on what you meant by that and why that would be important?
Well, as you say, the Canadian military family is a mirror of general changes in family form and function more broadly. So those influences have percolated down through military family systems as well, such that in the past, in a heterosexual relationship within the military, it was quite likely that the female identifying partner was staying at home, keeping the home fires burning, if you want to use that old adage. And through that daily work, in fact, one of the first studies I did way back in the day was articulating the nature of that work so that it was actually recognized and honored for the contribution it made, not just to family systems, but to the military system. In the last 25, 30 years, that has changed, where not unlike all of the rest of us, sometimes two incomes are required in a family to maintain economic well-being. So that has changed the dynamic within the family system, and there's no longer that person at home dedicated entirely to making everything work. And so that's been a huge shift that the military has not been immune from. And so there's been concern and wonderment about, okay, how do we replace that vital function? Because the military relied on that for generations. So that's been a huge shift. And also, while military ideologies, a lot of our work focuses on military culture and the ideologies that permeate that culture. While many of those well-founded ideologies are still in play, and they should be, there's also been shifts, like particularly the sense of community and cohesion within military families and within military base environments in particular. That's all been thrown up in the air in the last 25 or 30 years as well. So some of the social capital that was generated through living on base. And let me just say, I've done studies where base housing has been a factor, has emerged as a factor. It wasn't all lovely and supportive, but for the most part, there was, for better or for worse, a very good experience of growing up and living as a military family in those communities. And the social capital generated through the interactions there was really sustaining for many military family members and the members themselves, and by extension, the institution. Reasons beyond the scope of the family, there was no longer an investment by the CAF in maintaining those PMQ networks on base housing. So those are just a couple.
With these changes, Deb, you were saying how the quote-unquote female spouse was no longer in the home doing all the roles that are important to running a household but have moved on. I mean, now we're unpacking and identifying new challenges for military families, right? So what does it mean when the other partner is out working in the community? What does it mean for them finding a job within various communities, or for professionals that require to be registered, for example, from an organizing body, if they're moving from one area to another, I mean, there's new issues that we would have never imagined maybe 20 years ago that we would have to examine. And I think that's also really important to understand that with these shifts in these decisions around housing and schools for military kids within bases, there are things unforeseen fallout because of that. And I don't think policy has really kept up. And it's because of researchers like Deb that have really pinpointed these changes and the impact that it has on not only individual families, but on also policy that is required to support them. So it's like a trickle down effect. So identity is a big thing because these military families are living together in communities and they don't have that sort of sense of community and they're sort of dispersed within civilian communities. How does that play out in their sense of identity as a military family? So, I mean, these are all things that I think has played out in our peer countries with the shift in how military family life looks. But I mean, this is definitely stuff that is unanticipated. And like I said, I don't think the policies and the decision makers have really considered this.
No, they haven't. And, not to suggest that the military family resource support system isn't trying on a community level to create and sustain that. You and I both work very closely with that sector within the military helping system. And we have other colleagues who are very much engaged in policy and program development at a higher level from the community MFRC level. But nonetheless, they would all agree that there is a lag between how military families are living today in concert with their civilian counterparts vis-a-vis what's available to them. And, it is changing, but hundreds of years of practice is not going to be overthrown overnight. And despite the will, I always want to say when I talk about these issues that from my standpoint, there is the goodwill and the interest in closing that gap among the people that I work with, both in the community level and certainly with my good friends and colleagues as researchers. But it's taking a while. Closing that gap is a long, protracted process.
And I find that the support has shifted, or maybe I just wasn't aware who the players were when I first entered this area of work. But I find that there's definitely more reception from organizations like the MFRC and, D&D and CAF and other organizations to really sort of reach out and collaborate more openly with family researchers. I think it's the noise that we make over the years and drawing attention to families in concert with the families. And I think that has also changed. I think, Deb, you were embedded in this area before I was, but that's my take. Folks are much more open and willing to reach out to say, hey, you've got some expertise. You come from a different perspective. As family researchers, we'd love to talk.
Definitely. Although in my, not to focus on my own experience, but my whole research program popped out of some community-based experience I had with the first MFRC here in Halifax, where I live and work. So on the very local micro level, I've always seen that interest in collaboration and that synergy between what researchers do and what the community folks do, particularly in the MFRC sector. But you're quite right, Linna, as we've marched on, there's been growing interest in breaking down some of the silos and interest from both sides, mutual trust and understanding and keeping our eye on the prize, which is what can we do for families, right? Rather than saying, we're doing this and, each of us staking out our respective turfs, where I've really seen overt interest in, okay, let's just see what we can do, working together in tandem to make things better for our families. That's what we all want.
So much good information and thought and discussion in there. So thank you both for sharing that. I have a couple things that come to mind when I listen to you speak. One was about the expectation or just the way it was, the old adage that you suggested, where female identifying spouses or partners would be the ones that would be staying home and making sure the family, the house can function. Now these individuals, it's needed, maybe preferred, but it's needed that they have a second income. Does that situation change with both spouses or both partners working? Does that really change the context? There's still the military operations. I'm imagining that the expectations still fall on the partner that's outside the military once it's needed. And I think both of you could probably speak to that as well. Gendered expectations, or even I would also say non-military versus the military member as well, which typically follows gendered, as we know.
So during the pandemic, I was doing research that involved speaking to women in the military, and being the pandemic, inevitably how that plays out in their lives did come out. And these were women, most of them were from dual serving families. And repeatedly, they kept telling me that they were the ones, if it came right down to it, they were the ones who would work from home and still fill those gendered roles within the family, which for a lot of women was really difficult. And I spoke to women, various ranks, but it particularly came out very loud and clear in the high-ranking women who would be, they and their partner or both held leadership positions within the military. But when it came down to it, she was the one who was at home. Whenever she'd call into a meeting with a group of peers, I remember one story in particular where she was, a room full of high-ranking individuals, a mix of men and women. And out of the group where there typically should be 6 women sitting around the table, there was only physically 2 because the other were at home, but all the men made into the office. And there was some talk among the men that, why isn't she here? And so this person I was talking to took stock of how, despite her achievements within her career, there was still that expectation within the family that she or other women provide her. So I think, that needs to be better understood within military families. We didn't have this in the past where we had a larger cohort of women that are caregivers within families that are holding these really high-ranking positions. And I think in terms of research, this has really sort of opened the door to say, hey, who is looking at these women and their experiences? And that's something that I have a particular interest in understanding how military service really influences decisions women make. Because if you're not in the office, you might be missing out on some sort of conversation that might lead to A, B, or C. So I think, if anything, I'm proud to be part of this research area, but there's a lot more questions as we move on. And we have the attention of the decision makers within the military, and we have a good relationship with them. And I think that's so key. But it is those grassroots, like Deb was saying, the grassroots people and the individual conversations that are sparking the questions to ask the larger questions and what can be done. In my experience, talking to people, the traditional gender expectations within families do exist regardless of what professional career the woman has chosen.
Yeah, it's interesting. Linna, you're an expert in intersectionality. And as I learn more about it, I've always articulated military ideologies to family ideologies. And I think we can see how gender as an ideology is interdependently connected to militarism as an ideology as well. And at a broader level of analysis, I think keeping that in focus will be helpful. And you would well know, because we work together a lot, that we're now, and rightly, compelled to use a sex and gender lens to all of the work that we do, which is a fantastic shift forward in the relevance of our work, because gender and militarism are intersecting in very, very powerful ways.
Requiring researchers to put forth a statement on sex and gender analysis is important, but I think that too often it becomes a checkbox, right? It becomes too much of a checkbox, like, yeah, we're doing it, but without actually appreciating what that means. Does it mean disaggregating sex and gender data? It means having an understanding of how gender plays out in someone's experience that is layered onto, like you said, militarism, and how it's layered onto someone's social class or geography. And it's just a much more nuanced and complex way of approaching research, which I appreciate. And I always appreciate Dr. Norris, your theoretical mind, and really forcing us to think that way and be able to capture things in that manner. But I really think that that is something that I know that our research group really tries to do, is understand the complexity of someone's life and their different identities and how that plays out in their experiences, and more importantly, how it plays out in any programs and services and policies that get developed. My concern is too much research gets done where they call it intersectional and it's just disaggregating.
Yeah, so we always have to keep that in focus, right? And we'll keep each other in check, Linna.
Well, I don't
keep
know
working
if people
together.
Realize that as a early career researcher, I developed a lot of my skills and my knowledge from Dr. Norris, who has been a consummate mentor for me. And because of her training of me, I really am acutely aware of what that means. And so I think that our group of researchers do a really good job where we really try to understand how culture plays out, and not just military culture, because military families exist within the greater Canadian culture. So there's also the influences. So social changes within Canadian society will inevitably impact how military families function, just like we were saying earlier, going out more into the paid workforce. So it's really important for us as researchers to look at families within the context. And Dr. Norris, this is where your training of me comes in, is around the ecological context and understanding how those play play out. So it's more than just looking at the individual, looking at families, looking at them as either women or military families, but looking at how society shapes those experiences and be able to have a very macro as well as micro understanding of family life.
I'm quite proud of how we've all, thank you for your feedback on injecting more and more family science theory into the work that we do. But I see a real collective energy and interest in layering in that perspective because, as Nick, you may have discerned it, it shifts and extends the focus beyond responsibilizing the family for making it all work, as those good women did, for generations. Home fires burning, it was all on them, sometimes at their peril, right? And if they were having issues with it, everything was kept contained and underground, so they would not be judged for their rightly valued role. So yes, taking a perspective that extends the boundaries of responsibility and support is something that, Linna, I think we can all be very proud of in our group. We're all, as you say, making noise about that, which is long overdue, in my view. Yeah. I wanted to say, Nick, if I may, to circle back for a second to your question, I want to make sure that we also highlight, and Linna, you've been involved in some of this work as well, the fact that we're filling in gaps, that the heterosexist, heteronormative character of military family research, not just in our good country of Canada, but beyond, is quite startling when you start doing the digging and seeing what's out there. So another thing that we're trying to do in our group is render visible the voices of different family forms and function, all with an interest in highlighting diversity. So, for example, with a colleague of mine at PRA in Ottawa, Dr. Alice Gomarowski, we've done work on single parenting. One of my grad students did work back in the day on dual serving, interviewing mothers who are faced with that imponderable problem of what do I do when we're both deployed, right, at the same time, and we've got kids. And we have no extended clan close by. How do we handle that? Then I know we haven't really, to this point, to my knowledge, although I know there's interest in such, is focusing on families that live with different disabilities. How is that? How do families who are military families navigate through that? And then I've done some, what I call the lost generation research, which is research on adult children from a particular cohort, which now we're expanding beyond that more narrow scope and focus. So there's all these pockets of permutations and combinations of military family members that their experiences have never reached the light of day. So one by one, Linna, we're doing it, right? We're picking it off and using that critical ecological mindset and focus, trying to bring all that into focus so that we can understand. And as applied researchers, we can do something, help the helpers do something with that knowledge.
There's a couple things I want to highlight there. As expected, this conversation is amazing, and I love to be a part of it. You've highlighted, Dr. Norris, some key podcast guests that will be coming up in the future, and one of the episodes that we'll be highlighting is about changing families within the structure of families and what that looks like and how that impacts the work that everyone is doing. So this is a perfect lead into that. The other thing that I think is highlighted from a research institute or a research podcast is the idea of sex and gender-based analysis and SAGE guidelines, and the idea that this is what can really drive impact and understanding and change within policy. It's not just checking a box or telling the sample size of males versus females or even descriptively stating genders or who might be your participants. It's really looking at the context of all these individuals that are impacted by military, both within a family organization or by themselves or by their service. So I think that really highlights that context of if we want to get to impact, we want to get to understanding how we can support families. This is bringing research into impact with these methodologies and the guidelines that we're now all following and pushing forward. Another piece I wanted to highlight, it's where this could lead to one of the last questions of this episode already, is about adult children and the work that you've done, Dr. Norris, because that is something that I think is generational transmission within families as well, in a sense. So this idea of adult children, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. And Linna was a very valued colleague on the work that I did, funded. I was a grateful recipient of funding from the True Patriot Love Foundation, where the focus was on what I call that lost generation, individuals who came of age, whose parents, rather, served in the military between the Korean War and the Gulf War, that Cold War period. And why? Why did we want to focus on these folks? Was because as we were recruiting for other studies, and Linna, you would remember this, we would often get queries and interests from the adult children of these Canadian Armed Forces members that served in this particular time period. And it breaks our hearts when we have to say no. So finally, we looked at each other and said, well, why don't we design a study that will actually ask these folks what their experiences are? So we did. And thankfully, True Patriot Love helped us with that. So yes, there's so much I could say, Nick, about that work. And I should also add that it's expanded beyond that cohort examination to a broader focus on adult children. In this case, I'm grateful to the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families for supporting that work. So there's a lot to unpack with the adult children research. For example, I'll try to give you a high-level overview. The overlay of militarism within the military family system, particularly in that first study, the lost generation, whose fathers or mothers, mostly it was fathers, served between the Korean and the Gulf Wars, was very dominant, very prominent. We did see that heteronormative gender dichotomy within the family system, and that to some extent was instrumental in maintaining cohesion at the family level, as well as the unit level, and ultimately at the level of the military institution. There was a lot of examples of resiliency. The conceptualization of resiliency that I use is one that's not about puppy dogs and chocolate chip cookies and everything's lovely. It's, resiliency is only honed through and by adversity. So there were adversities that were shared, but also very amazing stories of resiliency that grew from that. And by resiliency, not a bouncing back or getting back to what you were like before all those things happened, but it's about developing new skills and abilities that bounce you forward rather than bouncing back. But some of the adversities emanated from practices that, without sounding judgmental, that were prominent at that time, such as the drinking culture. Many people talked about the cheap beer available in the mess halls on base. And remember, most of these families lived on base, not in the economy, which is the phraseology used to describe civilian housing. So the drinking culture was acceptable and manageable until it wasn't. And many of these folks said that once it wasn't, there was no supports. There was no Alcoholics Anonymous interventions unless that was acquired on City Street. Nothing endemic to the military institution. Also, very interestingly, there was a transfer of the military authoritarianism to the family system. Many of the folks I interviewed said Dad treated me like a little soldier, inspecting how I made my bed, what was in my school bag. Not that this authoritarian parenting isn't just prominent in these families, but it certainly was alive and well in the families represented in this study. I'm trying to keep this brief, Nick. I could talk about this for an hour in of itself, but what I came away with were certainly deeper insight into some of those adversities that in some cases were the springboards to resiliency, which is a key point to the work, but also many, if all of them, and there were 32 people in this study, all of them indicated that they developed social skills, empathy, a capacity for care and connection because of where they grew up. And where they grew up, largely, as I've noted, was on base communities. They would talk about, when a moving truck rolled into the PMQ, they would all run to see who the kids were. There was always kids, of course, but who the kids were and how old they were and who would be joining their social peer group on base. And remember, these base communities were self-contained. Everything was there. Schools, churches, recreational facilities, cannexes. You didn't have to go outside the boundary. And having grown up in Halifax myself, I'm not a military kid, but I remember being amazed at how my friends that were military children never had to leave the base. Everything was there. It was quite phenomenal for a civilian child growing up with them. So yes, empathy, care, connection, such that when they grow up, because one of the significant goals for this project was to see how this formative experience in the early years played out or didn't across the life course. Without exception, I remember it's qualitative work, so we can't generalize, but without exception, these folks were intent on getting engaged in careers of public service. Some of that meant they joined the military themselves, but if not, they were involved in helping professions or public service, government work where they were serving their country. I found that to be quite phenomenal. The last thing I'll say, and I'll stop after that because again, I could go on forever about this work, is the military brat identity. At first, I was reticent about when I heard the phrase, when the individuals in the study would refer to themselves this way, I would internally cringe, like thinking, do you really want to call yourself that? And when I queried a few people on that, they said, absolutely, it's a badge of honor. It's who we are. And Linna, you talked about identity earlier in this podcast. Significant. The brat identity is significant to their health and well-being, not just when they were kids, but as they grew forward into adulthood, doing whatever they ended up doing. That to me was a light bulb moment when I realized how meaningful that badge of honor of being the military brat, such that many of them still hang out together virtually now through social media. One of my research assistants just did a count for me because of the Atlas work that we're doing. There are 8 active Facebook groups right now for middle-aged and older military brats that grew up during this time period. And again, circling back to a point I made earlier, a lot of that is because of the social capital, I'm convinced, the social capital that was generated and sustained through living on base. Now, we're not going to go back and get base housing communities back in play. But if there's lessons to be learned in the 2020s and beyond, is how can we create a system of support for military families that, to a great extent, I would wager, replicates that experience of social capital that was prominent. Not that it always worked for all families. There were stories, heartbreaking stories of dysfunction within the sample in that first study. But there were a lot of evidence to suggest that the social capital generated through those communities was instrumental in maintaining family health and well-being, which we know, because we're ecological, right, Linna, extends out beyond to all the other layers between the family and the institution. Among all the work I've been privileged to be able to do, this one is within that number. I'm really, really grateful that I've had the opportunity to bring those voices out because they were underground for years, generations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deb. That was a great high-level overview. As you've mentioned a couple times, you could talk about this for hours. I could ask questions and listen to this conversation for hours, but unfortunately, we are out of time today. I do want to thank both of you for taking the time out and sharing your experience, your research, your knowledge with the Beyond the Battlefield podcast, and I think the listeners are really going to enjoy this one today. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Linna, as well.
It's nice chatting with you, Deb.
Thank you again to Drs. Tam-Seto and Norris. Please continue the conversation with us by following CIMVHR and CIMVHR on Facebook and LinkedIn. Now that you've listened to the Beyond the Battlefield podcast, episode 2, we invite you to complete a short survey by clicking the survey link in the podcast description section below. Your input helps us create content that's valuable to you. On the next week's episode, we sit down with Dr. Sharon Law and Larissa Lamrock. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. Until next time, take care and stay well. Goodbye for now.